Hello, and welcome to CAWST's online training, The Sand in Biosand, Getting to the Heart of the Biosand Filter. My name is Candice Young-Rojansky. I'm a member of the CAWST Research and Learning Department, and I'll be giving the presentation to you today. I'd like to begin by just introducing who CAWST is. We're the Center for Affordable Water and Sanitation Technology. We are a water, sanitation, and hygiene not-for-profit organization that provides support for domestic, non-networked systems. We have over 1,000 client organizations in over 100 countries to whom we provide our services. We support our clients by walking beside organizations to help start projects, improve the quality of projects, or scale up projects. The services we deliver to support this are training workshops, by providing education and training resources, providing consulting support, or assisting clients in doing action research projects. This short and introductory webinar is a small but not insignificant part of that service. I'd like to start the webinar just by going over what the scope of what we're covering today is. We're going to discuss how the sand in a biosand filter removes pathogens from the water, choosing the right type of sand, and things about proper sand sizing. We're not going to cover anything about the construction of the container of the biosand filter. So we're not going to discuss concrete construction or the advantages of concrete versus plastic containers or anything along that line. We're also not going to talk about filter use and maintenance or anything to do with project implementation. The learning objectives of this session are that by the end of the webinar, you will be able to explain how the biosand filter sand removes pathogens from the water, to identify the most important characteristics of filter sand, and to list some tools that can be used to analyze sand characteristics. I'm assuming that most people have some knowledge or experience with biosand filters, or you wouldn't have chosen to listen to so specific and technical a webinar topic. So I'm not going to go into any detail in describing the filter itself. On the other hand, this is a big topic to be covered in only 1 hour. So it may be that I don't cover some of the topics that you're really interested in to the depth that you'd like. Please give us an email. I'll give you the email address at the end of the webinar if you would like more information. As a quick overview of what we're going to talk about in the next 40 minutes, I'm going to start with discussing why we use the filter, before moving on to how the sand removes pathogens, going over some characteristics of the sand, how to prepare it, and some available tools for testing your sand. I want us to always keep in mind as we discuss this the main reason for why we're doing this. We don't want to get perfect sand in our filters in order to check off some box, or so that myself or a technical advisor at CAWST or someone else approves of it. We're dealing with water filtration in order to save people's lives by reducing preventable waterborne deaths and illness. It isn't technical or a theoretical reason. People are really going to be drinking the water coming out of this filter, and so we want to make sure that it's as safe as it possibly can be. Now, when I did a practice run of this session, my partner's response to me was, "Who knew sand could be so complicated?" Now, I don't want that to be the main thing that you're thinking when you walk away from this webinar. The biosand filter is a simple technology to make, use, and maintain. But since it's a biological process, there are lots of really interesting and fascinating things that are happening behind the scenes. You don't need to become an expert on everything I'm telling you today in order to have a very successful project. But it's good to know that these things are happening in the background so that you can make good decisions and have the best water that you can. Remember too that you always have CAWST staff whose it's our job to help people have successful wash projects, including biosand filter projects. You can always contact us for help. Now, one last thing before I dive in. Most of this information is available to you from the Biosand Filter Manual. If you don't have a copy, it's freely available online from CAWST's website. So biosand filters are used to remove pathogens which are making people ill. The primary goal is improved water quality for improved health, especially for young children. There are 4 main classes of pathogens. They're all different sizes. Now, the processes involved in removing these pathogens are different. The largest of the pathogens that we're concerned with are the helminths, or worms. Now, this is the only time that you're going to hear me talk about worms in this presentation because they're relatively large, and the only way I can imagine a sand filter of any sort not removing them is for you to forget to put the sand in altogether. Now, the protozoa are smaller than the helminths, but they're also removed quite well by biosand filters, even if the sand isn't quite right. So we won't focus too much on them either. On the flip side, I'll keep mentioning viruses over and over again because they're the most difficult to remove or inactivate, and because they're believed to cause a very large proportion of children's diarrhea. Depending on which paper you read, rotavirus alone is thought to cause up to 450,000 children's deaths per year, or up to 37% of diarrheal deaths. So the viruses are extremely important, and they are the most tricky to remove. What we're most concerned about when we're talking about getting the sand right are the bacteria and the viruses. Now, as a quick brain quiz, if a virus was the size of a bean, how large do you think a grain of filter sand would be? If you chose a football pitch, then you'd be correct. The viruses are extremely small. We're now going to talk about what is happening inside the biosand filter. Now, it's difficult to illustrate this issue of the very small pathogens compared to the very large sand grains when we're talking about these processes. So in these pictures, the microbes look about the same size as the sand. However, keep the real sizes in mind as we continue our discussion. So the simplest and most easy to understand process occurring in the biosand filter is straining. This process is similar to when you're cooking pasta and pour the noodles into a strainer. The water goes through, but the noodles are captured. The pore size of the sand is smaller than the larger organisms, like worms, so they are trapped on the surface of the filter. Even a brand new biosand filter will be quite good at removing worms, simply because they're too big to pass through the pores. Over time, silt and different things that are captured on top of the filter will reduce the pore size even more, and then the filter will become even more effective at removing organisms through straining, until the user gets irritated at the slowness of the filter and maintains it. Mechanical trapping is not an important way that bacteria or viruses are removed from the filter. The pore spaces are just too large. However, it is important for helminths and protozoa. Adsorption refers to the microbes getting stuck to the sand grains. These are photos of the biolayer, or the Schmutzdecke, on a regular slow sand filter using an electron microscope. The papers that I've taken these photos from are freely available online if you want to look them up. You can see that the sand grains are covered with fibrous scaly coating caused by biofilms. Now, the entire filter is biologically active, but the biolayer is the most important part for protozoan and bacterial removal, and it's where the majority of the biofilms are developed. Now, viruses are removed throughout the entire filter bed. They're stuck to sand grains through biological processes, but there are also other physical and chemical processes working on them. All of these absorptive processes tend to be rather weak. So if the flow rate of the filter is too high, the bacteria and viruses will detach themselves from the sand grain, and they'll wash back into the drinking water coming out of the filter. Now, the forces holding the viruses seem to be especially weak, so this is a bigger problem with them. One of the more complicated removal processes is predation. The natural ecosystem contains complicated food chains with different organisms eating and being eaten. Now, we're all familiar with food chains at the larger scale. The mouse eats the grass, the snake eats the mouse, the hawk eats the snake. Nature creates balance in the system so that all populations stay at a particular sustainable level. The same thing happens at the microbial scale in rivers and lakes. Other microorganisms that prey on our pathogens already exist in nature. If a pathogen is present within a system, then its predator can probably be found in the system too. In the Biosand filter, one of the things we are doing is capturing these predators, then feeding them and providing them with their perfect living conditions so that they will multiply. This mechanism is thought to be very important for bacterial removal. In this case, the sand is acting in a couple of ways. One is to provide a home for these predators. Some of the predators swim, but others do not. And the comparatively large surfaces provided by the sand particles give them a home. Another is to provide a surface to capture their food. Organisms which are adhered to surfaces are then easier prey for predators. The final mechanism for removing pathogens is natural death. Organisms that are stuck to sand grains, or just in the filter otherwise, may starve or reach the end of their life stage without having a chance to reproduce. The living conditions within the filter are not optimal for most of these organisms, so they just die. There are two main processes that occur over time to help them improve filter functioning. The first is usually referred to as filter ripening. This refers to the development of the biolayer. This takes a few weeks to about a month to fully develop. This allows the filter to remove bacteria and protozoa. The second process we'll refer to as media aging. It's completely different. It takes much longer, 6 months to a year, and has to do with mineral deposition and biological communities deep within the filter bed. This improves the removal of viruses within the filter. We're now going to go over some different characteristics of sand. Before we get into the different ways that you can describe the filter sand, let's just think about some of the ways that the sand qualities affect their removal mechanisms that we just discussed. These things are all related to one another, but I just want to draw attention to them. Remember that bacteria and viruses are largely removed from the filter by adsorption. That is, by somehow getting stuck to a sand grain. One way to make it more likely that they will stick to something is by having a large number of surfaces for them to stick to. So we want to try to have as much surface as possible within our sand. The flow rate is absolutely critical. The microbes, especially the viruses, but bacteria too, tend to only be weakly attached to the sand grains. If the flow rate is too fast, they will wash back off the sand. Just this week, I've been emailing with a client whose filters weren't working as well as they should. They were at a school and using the filter for learning, so they were taking very frequent bacteria tests, and they could see that it wasn't removing as much as it should. Their maximum flow rate was 600 milliliters per minute, which is much higher than CAWST recommendation. By lowering the flow rate down to the recommended rate, they saw an immediate difference in how their filter performed for bacterial removal. I'll come back to flow rate testing at the end of this presentation. Now I have a caution here. You may have filters which are running fast, but you've tested the bacteria and it's okay. So you may think that it doesn't matter, that everything is good. Remember though, that bacteria and viruses are very different from one another, and they're removed in different ways. Viruses are held more weakly to the sand particles and wash off more easily. If you're only testing bacteria, you may not know that your viruses are getting through. Pore size is also important. This is the space between the particles. One of the reasons is for mechanical trapping, but as we already discussed, that isn't really an important way that bacteria and viruses are removed. By having smaller pore sizes, you're forcing the water to make many bends and turns as it navigates its way through the sand. All of these bends increase the chances that our bacteria and viruses will come in contact with sand and hopefully stick to it. Think about walking down an empty, straight, and wide highway. You aren't very likely to touch the edges. Now think of a crowded market bazaar. Even with no other people, just the stalls, because of the narrowness of the aisles and the turning of the pathways, the chances that you accidentally bump into something are much higher. From all that, I think it's likely pretty clear to everyone why you would need to have as small a grain size as possible for good removal. There has been research on this topic, and it's pretty clear that the smaller the grain size, the better the filter performance. Smaller grain sizes lead to higher surface areas, slower flow rates, and smaller pore sizes. I'm going to give you the details of the recommended numbers in a few minutes. I didn't include them on these first few slides because I want to focus on the concepts and not get distracted by the specifics. But don't worry, it's coming. Now we use two measures to describe the grain size. The first is maximum grain size. This is the diameter of your largest sand grains. In practice, this is usually the size of the sieve that you're using during your sand preparation. It may not be, however. If you purchased your sand and all of it goes through the sieve easily, then your maximum grain size may actually be smaller than your sieve. You'll have to just check to make sure that your filter isn't too slow in this case. The other measure for describing grain size is the effective size. This is different than the maximum size. The grains at the maximum size help the filter to flow faster, within reason. The grains at the effective size are what contribute most to the pore size and to the sand's actual resistance to flow. The effective size is the diameter of the 10th percentile of the grains. This means that 10% of the grains in the sand are smaller than this particular grain size, and 90% are bigger. If you took 100 people and made them stand in a line from tallest to shortest, the person 10 in from the shortest would be the 10th percentile height. There will always be a 10th percentile. If you have 100 pens that are almost identical, you will still have tiny differences, and one will be the 10th percentile in length, just by definition, the same as there is always a longest and a shortest, or a heaviest and a lightest. You measure effective size using a sieve analysis. However, you can also get an idea about whether your effective size is good by looking at your flow rate. If your flow rate is good, then your effective size is probably within the right range. Let's take a couple of moments now just to test ourselves on this concept. Here are 4 different sand types. I'd like you just to take a couple of seconds and think of which of these sands you think would represent a high effective grain size. If you picked sand A, then you're correct. Sand A's 10th percentile sand grain size would be quite high. Sand D would be exceptionally low, and sand B and C would be something small, but not exceptionally so. Now, the size distribution is a description grains are all the same size, or whether there are lots of different sizes all mixed together. Like with most things in life, we want a lot of diversity in our sand. This helps us to balance the challenge of having the smallest pore spaces and the highest surface area possible without having a filter too slow for people to use. If all of the sand grains were really tiny, the filter would work brilliantly, but no one would use it because it's too slow. If all the sand grains were larger, the flow rate would be higher, but the filter wouldn't remove much. So we want a large range of sizes. By making sure we have some on the larger end, closer to our maximum grain size, we make sure that the filter is fast enough to be useful. By making sure that we have lots on the smaller end, closer to our effective grain size, we make sure that the filter actually works. The size distribution is described by the uniformity coefficient. A uniformity coefficient close to 1 means that the grains are all similar in size, while a high uniformity coefficient means that they are different. Now, 2 of these pictures show sand with a very low uniformity coefficient. Take a moment and see if you can figure out which 2 they are. It is sands A and D. You can see in these pictures that in sands A and D, the grain sizes are very similar to one another. This represents a low uniformity coefficient. One of the other parameters that you're interested in is the silt content. Silt are the very, very tiny sands of grain, or grains of sand. They look and feel very powdery. There are a couple of reasons why you want to minimize your silt. One reason is that the sand preparation, especially the washing, is going to kill you if you have too much silt. Preparing filter sand is never easy, but from personal experience, when there's too much silt, it can be a horrible, horrible experience. The manual describes washing the sand 3 or 4 times and testing to see if that's enough. With a high silt sand, you can sometimes be washing your sand 20 times, and you might still need to wash it more. Once you've washed the silt away, if it was a big portion of your sand, your sieve analysis results will be different. The sieve analysis you did at the quarry will no longer be very accurate. Your sand might be quite a bit larger than you thought it was. But the most important reason about why you want to minimize your silt is that what tends to happen with sand that has a high silt content when it's installed is that the first flow rate in your filter is slow, and might meet specs, but then the silt washes out and the flow rate increases. This can have some different consequences. One might be that your filter is producing higher turbidity water coming out than was going in, which is disconcerting to your user. Another problem is that you, as the person installing the filter, might test the flow rate at the beginning, right after the filter is installed, but it's not like you're going to test it every day afterwards. So you won't be able to tell that your flow rate has been increasing. You walk away thinking that the filter is working well, but it isn't. And neither you nor the person drinking the water from that filter knows that it isn't okay. One of our international consultants was recently helping a client to investigate some filters and found this exact problem. On the other hand, you do want some of this fine material to still be left in the sand because it has a very high surface area and it helps to reduce the flow rate. It's a careful balance. Now, the easiest way to get an idea of whether your sand has an appropriate amount of fines is to do a jar test when you're cleaning the sand. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. Now, 2 of these sands would likely have too slow a flow rate for users. Can you figure out which 2 they would be? It would be sands B and D. They're very filled in with silt, suggesting that there's too low an effective size. Well, there's just too low a silt content. What we mean by organics are the little bits of decaying plant and animal material that can be in the sand. It might be obvious, like the leaf in this picture, or it might be less obvious, like microbes. This is mainly a problem with sand that comes from near the surface of the ground. Sand from a rock quarry usually wouldn't have very much organics. The concern with organics in a filter is that they are a very good food source. The thing is, we want to create a food chain situation in our filter where pathogens are the things getting eaten. If there are other food sources, then things can get out of balance. The predators might eat this other food instead of eating the pathogens. Or other organisms might take over the filter that like this organic food source and crowd out the predators that we want to be eating the pathogens. What sometimes happens when there are lots of organics is that the coliforms get really happy in the filter and more come out than go in. Now, if we're using coliforms as a test of how well our filter is working, this might make things really confusing and it'll look as if the filter is actually contaminating the water. Another thing that happens is that sand with organics in it also often has pathogens in it, so you might actually be contaminating the water instead of purifying it. Now, removing pathogens is not too difficult. You basically need to bleach the sand with chlorine, then wash the sand really well to get rid of the bleach. Getting rid of the organics, however, is really difficult and expensive. you would need to heat the sand to a very high temperature to burn off the organics. It's almost always better to find a new sand source in those situations. Now, I was part of a project once that had this problem. It wasn't river sand in this case. We were using sand from a shallow pit, and since the pit was very shallow, there was probably organic contamination even though we couldn't see anything. We tried everything. We even bleached the sand and then thoroughly rinsed it. But after 1 year going back, the filters were still off. There were some other issues, but what it really came down to was that we should have used a different sand source. I get a lot of questions about what type of rock the sand should come from and whether this is important. In most cases, the answer is that it doesn't really matter that much, so long as you use your common sense and don't take sand that has come from a toxic waste dump, for example, or from an oil spill, or that you reasonably expect to be covered in something radioactive or poisonous. As a last resort, things like bleach can sometimes help disinfect sand that's been contaminated with microbes, so long as you make sure to get rid of all the bleach from the sand. But we don't have anything to decontaminate sand that has been contaminated with chemicals. Another exception is sand that has quite a lot of calcium in it, like from limestone. In these cases, the calcium has a tendency to dissolve in the water going through the filter, and strange things can happen that can create opportunities like big flow paths to be created, which stop the filter from removing pathogens very effectively. The dangerous part is that the user wouldn't necessarily know that their filter wasn't working. Now, don't panic here and think that you need to go out and get expensive tests on your sand to find out whether you have calcium in it. If you don't know whether your sand is too high in calcium, it probably isn't anything to worry about. In places where this is a problem, you would probably see that it's a problem just from other construction that's been done in the area. You would see that there was high rates of erosion on buildings that were using the same rock source, for example. Another very common question is about salt. And we recommend that you stay away from sand that has a lot of salt in it. Several staff here at CAWST have run into cases where the sand has been contaminated with salt, like from when there's salty groundwater. They've found that if the sand is really well washed before being put in the filter, it is possible to remove the salt since it dissolves, but it is a very tedious and difficult process. It's better to find a new sand source. Now, the shape of the sand is not as important as the other parameters, but there are often lots of questions about it, and it can play a role in treatment performance. In many of my illustrations in this presentation, I've been showing the sand drawn as a circle. However, that's not how sand and rocks are in real life. One of the interesting properties of a sphere or ball is that they have the smallest possible surface area. An uneven, angular sand grain from a quarry will have a larger surface area than a nicely eroded, smooth sand grain from a beach or a river. The rounder sand won't work as well at the beginning of a filter's life. But studies have shown that this is one of the least important of the sand characteristics when you're looking at filter performance in the long run. After a year or so, once you have mineral deposits and biofilms on your sand grains, ruining the soft, smooth finish, there isn't really a difference between filters made with angular sand versus round sand. It does take time though, and for the first while, a filter made with a rounder grained sand, such as a beach or river sand, won't work as well. Now, the bigger issue with beach or river sand has to do with organic content rather than angularity. Which leads us into source selection. Really, if it's at all possible, you should be getting your sand from a rock quarry. This sand has a nice distribution of sizes, it's angular, it has very little organic contamination. You can ask the local roadworks company or construction companies for information on where to find a quarry. If you're really stuck, you can contact CAWST, and we might actually know of a quarry in the country where you're doing your projects. In the unlikely situation that there isn't a rock quarry, which really is very, very unusual, the next best choice would be a sand quarry. The sand is more likely to be contaminated though, as I described earlier with my own experience. Now, aside from having lots of contaminants in them because their source is close to the surface, both beach and desert sands are not appropriate to use as filter media because they tend to have all of the grain sizes grains about the same size. They don't have a good mix of grain sizes like we were talking about earlier with the grain size distribution and uniformity coefficient. We get a lot of questions here about river sand. We don't recommend using river sand. The sand is not clean. It has dirt, organics, and pathogens in it. If you really must get your sand from a river or nowhere else, take it from the river banks and not the river bottom. But even then, I would do a lot of testing to make sure that the filter actually works, because it might not work very well. The filter will probably not work if you take the sand from the river bottom. There's just too much decaying organic matter, which provides too much food in the filter. That perfect ecosystem that we're trying to create will be distorted, because instead of getting lots of good predators in our filter, we'll have lots of organisms who love this decaying organic matter. Sand on the river bottom also usually has a low uniformity coefficient, meaning that the sand grains are close to the same size. You can use river sand for building the concrete box, however, but really try to find quarry sand for doing the treatment. Remember here that our purpose in making these filters to start with is to keep people from getting sick and really to save kids' lives. It's worth doing it in a way that really does keep them from getting sick. We have a lot of responsibility here. It isn't just about finding any sand. It's not making filters for the sake of making filters. It's about making a filter that works. If you're in a situation where you don't have an appropriate sand source, it's worth talking to a CAWST staff member about getting more information about other household water treatment options. The final sand parameter I want to touch on is how much sand you need. The sand depth contributes to filtration in several ways. One is that deeper sand gives you more pore volume, which means that you can dose more water. With biosand filters, water needs to be in contact with sand during the pause period, so the amount of water you can pour through at any time is limited by how much pore space you have in the sand. With deeper sand, you also have more surface area that each drop of water comes in contact with. Deeper sand also reduces the flow rate, since it provides more resistance to flow. So as promised, here are some actual numbers for your reference. The maximum flow rate refers to the fastest flow at the very beginning of a filter run, when it's at its fastest, before the filter is ripened. This should slow down nicely once you have biofilms forming and other things starting to clog your filter. In a standard concrete filter, that maximum flow rate is 400 milliliters per minute. Now, if you have measured 450 milliliters in a minute, that isn't a crisis. If you have measured 500 milliliters per minute, your sand is off. You need to uninstall the filter. Remember, the flow rate is important by itself, but it's also an indicator of the surface area and pore spaces in the filter. Finding other ways to slow the filter down will help, and we've seen different ways that people have done this, but it won't solve these other problems. If your filter is fast, it means the sand is wrong. You should uninstall and fix the problem. If your flow rate is good, the other parameters probably are too. You can get the actual numbers by doing a sieve analysis. Now I've written here 0.4 meters cubed per meter squared per hour. That's not actually the maximum flow rate. That's the maximum hydraulic loading rate. You can use that number to calculate the maximum flow rate for a non-standard biosand filter, or a biosand filter other than the concrete box that might have a different surface area. Now, we recommend a sand depth of at least 50 centimeters. The standard concrete filter has just under 55 centimeters of sand. Now, the step-by-step instructions about how to prepare the filter sand are in your biosand filter manual. And I think that it is also explained very nicely there. So we're going to move rather quickly through this next bit. So you found a good sand source. What is next? You start by sieving the sand through a 0.7 millimeter screen so that your maximum grain size is no more than 0.7 millimeters. Now, you next would wash the sand. To do this, you put some sieved filtration sand into a bucket. This is the sand that's gone through the 0.7 millimeter screen. Fill the bucket half full of clear water. Swirl the sand around using your hand or a clean stick or spoon. And dump the water out of the bucket, holding back the sand with your hand so it doesn't fall out. Pour the water down a drain or into a settling tank. If you're using a settling tank, then you can reuse the water once the dirt has settled down to the bottom. And because sand preparation takes a huge amount of water, this is a really good idea. Now you repeat this several times, counting how many times you wash the sand. Next, you would do a jar test, which I'll talk about in a second. Once you've completed many batches of sand, you would install a filter and check the flow rate. Once you're more experienced at washing sand, you should be able to tell quickly if the sand has been washed enough. But every load of sand you buy will be different. Always check the wash sand by doing jar tests and a trial installation. The water you dump out of the bucket should still be a little dirty when you finish washing the sand. You do not want to wash the sand until it's completely clean. You do need to maintain some of the fines or the silt. Finally, you store the sand in a clean, dry, protected place. After all that work, you don't want wind blowing leaves and dust into your sand or dogs contaminating it. And I've also run into problems with children liking to play in it. Now you can also bag the sand for transportation. You'll need about 30 liters of sand per filter for the concrete filters. So finally, I'm going to discuss some of the available tools that I keep mentioning. We have three main tools available to us for checking the appropriateness of our filter sand. The simplest is the flow test. The more in-depth method is the sieve analysis. And the jar test is used during the sand preparation to get a feeling for your silt. So the jar test helps you to know whether the sand has been correctly washed. The instructions are found in the Biosand Filter Construction Manual, and that is available online. How it basically works is that you put a little bit of your sand in your jar, maybe a third of the jar full, add water up to the very top, put on your lid, shake it very well. After 4 seconds, you look inside your jar and see if you can see through the side to see the top of your sand. If you can't see the very top of your sand, then your sand is still too dirty. If the water is clear, then your sand is too clean. You can't use that sand for the filters. If the water is still kind of dusty, but you can see the top of the sand, then your sand is correct. So the most important test is the flow test. This measures the fastest flow in the filter. This is what decides whether loosely attached microbes will be pulled off the sand grains and get back into the water or not. Now there are several variations of the flow test. All of them work. One way is to measure how much water is filtered over 1 minute and using some sort of graduated cylinder or container with markings on it. The other is to test how long it takes for the filter to filter a certain amount of water, say a 500 milliliter bottle. We have actually done some testing here, and the results of the methods are pretty much the same. The important thing is that you're measuring at the fastest point. So if you take 1 minute to jump from having poured water into the filter to grabbing your timer and your bottle, that isn't a big deal. but if you take 5 minutes or 10 minutes, your flow rate won't be accurate anymore since the filter slows down as it runs. As mentioned before, our recommendation for the standard concrete filter is 400 milliliters per minute. And you can calculate for your own filter if it has a different surface area using that maximum hydraulic loading rate of 0.4 meters cubed per meter squared per hour. Now, because viruses, which are more loosely attached in the filter bed, can be more easily resuspended than bacteria, which are more likely to be killed or attached to the biolayer, it isn't enough just to do water quality testing, like measuring coliforms or E. coli coming out of the filter, and using that as a conclusive test of whether or not the filter is working. You might have very good bacterial removal, but poor viral removal. So looking at flow rate is an important thing to be done in conjunction with water quality testing. If your filter is running too fast, this is a sign that there is a problem, even if your bacteria tests are all coming out good. Now, if we remember our important things to keep in mind, you may have noticed that they all fit together. By having a larger surface area and a more tortuous flow path, we will likely have a smaller flow rate. For this reason, if your resources are limited, the flow rate test will give you the best bang for your buck. The flow rate is important in and of itself, but it's also important as an indicator of whether or not these other things are in place. Now, doing a sieve analysis isn't as complicated as you might think, or a sand grain analysis. We have some links to some resources to show you how to do it. If you're interested, just give us an email or check out our website. We have an instructional video on YouTube. We have instructions on how to make a sieve set, instructions on how to do the analysis, and Samaritan's Purse, the not-for-profit organization, even worked with us to create a tool that does all of the calculations for you. It was designed to help us not need to draw curves or read log graphs or any of that more complicated analysis. You just fill in your numbers from your sieve analysis and it tells you whether or not your sand passes the criteria. Now, if you have in-country resources to have an analysis done, like a university soils lab, you can do that. Or you can build the sieves yourself. Or you can order a set of sieves from CAWST. If you have any difficulties at all, just give us an email and we'll help you out. Now, in the future, or right after we've finished listening to this webinar, you can download materials from our website on household water treatment and safe storage, or on or the Biosand filter manual, or the sand sieve analysis resources, for example. These are available at resources.cawst.org. CAWST provides training workshops and trainings in water sanitation and hygiene globally, so you can look to our website on training and find out what options are available to you in your region. That's at cawst.org/training. Of course, if you have specific project inquiries, it is CAWST's role to support more effective WASH programming. And so you can just send us an email at support@cawst.org and we'll do our best to help you out. And if you have a question specific to this webinar, you can email trainer@cawst.org with that question. I thank you for your participation, and we at CAWST wish you every success in your projects. Thank you.